The morning mist hung over Windsor Castle like a shroud, matching the somber mood that had settled over the royal family in the days following Prince Philip's death. Harry sat in his temporary accommodation, staring out at the grounds where he had once played as a child with William, their grandfather, watching from the terrace with that familiar mixture of pride and stern disapproval that had defined so much of their relationship. The phone call from the palace had come 3 days earlier, delivered with the cold efficiency that characterized most of his interactions with the institution these days. The voice on the other end had been polite but firm, explaining the protocols for the funeral service, the seating arrangements, the order of procession. Then came the words that hit him like a physical blow. "Your Royal Highness will be attending in morning dress, not military uniform." Harry had set the phone down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. He understood the implications immediately. After stepping back from royal duties, after the interviews and the revelations, after everything that had transpired over the past year, this felt like the final severance of a connection that had once meant everything to him. The irony was not lost on him that Andrew, his uncle who had been forced to step back from public duties amid scandal, would be permitted to wear his naval uniform. Andrew, who had served honorably in the Falklands but whose recent associations had brought shame upon the family name, would stand in full military regalia, while Harry, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had dedicated his post-military life to supporting veterans, would appear in civilian clothes. Meghan found him that evening sitting in their garden in California, having flown back immediately after receiving the news. She said nothing at first, simply placing her hand on his shoulder as they watched Archie play on the swing set Harry had built himself, determined to give his son the kind of simple, joyful childhood moments that had been rare in his own upbringing. "I keep thinking about Afghanistan," Harry finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the guys I served with. About what they would think seeing me stripped of the right to wear the uniform I earned alongside them." Meghan squeezed his shoulder gently. She had learned when to speak and when to simply be present during these moments when the weight of his former life pressed down on him like a physical force. She understood that this was about more than clothing or protocol. This was about identity, about belonging, about the fundamental question of who Harry was allowed to be in the eyes of the institution that had shaped every aspect of his existence for 36 years. "The uniform doesn't make the soldier," she said quietly. "Your service, your commitment to those who served with you, your work with Invictus Games, all of that exists regardless of what you wear to one ceremony." Harry nodded, knowing she was right but feeling the sting nonetheless. The military had been his salvation after Diana's death, the one place where he had felt truly useful, truly valued for what he could contribute rather than the accident of his birth. When everything else in his life had felt performative or hollow, his service had been real. He remembered his first deployment to Afghanistan in 2007, cut short when news of his presence leaked to the media. The frustration of being pulled out when he had finally found his place, when he had been just another soldier doing his job, had been overwhelming. But they had given him another chance, and during his second tour as an Apache pilot, he had finally experienced what it meant to be valued for his skills rather than his status. The men and women he had served with had never cared about his title. They cared about whether he could do the job, whether he had their backs, whether he understood the weight of responsibility that came with holding other people's lives in his hands. In the cockpit of an Apache helicopter, providing cover for ground troops, he had finally found a version of himself he could respect. Now, as he prepared to return to England for his grandfather's funeral, that identity felt under attack in a way that went beyond the obvious symbolism. The palace's decision sent a clear message about how they viewed his service, his sacrifice, his continued commitment to military causes. It was as if they were saying that stepping away from royal duties negated everything he had done in uniform, everything he continued to do for veterans and active service members through his charitable work. The flight to London was long and lonely. Meghan stayed behind in California, officially due to pregnancy complications, but Harry suspected she was also trying to avoid the inevitable media circus that would surround her presence. The British press had never forgiven her for what they saw as taking Harry away from them, and her appearance at such a solemn occasion would shift focus from grieving Philip to rehashing old controversies. Harry spent the hours over the Atlantic thinking about his grandfather, trying to separate his personal grief from the institutional politics that now seemed to overshadow everything. Philip had been a complicated figure in his life, sometimes stern and distant, other times surprisingly supportive and understanding. The Duke of Edinburgh had served with distinction in the Royal Navy during World War II, and Harry had always sensed that his grandfather understood the appeal of military service, the clarity and purpose it provided. During Harry's darkest period after his mother's death, when he had been drinking too much and making headlines for all the wrong reasons, it had been Philip who suggested military service might give him direction. The boy needs structure, he had told Charles, according to family lore. Needs to learn what it means to serve something bigger than himself. The old man had been right. The military had saved Harry in ways that therapy and time alone never could have. It had given him purpose, identity, and, most importantly, it had shown him a world beyond the suffocating protocols of royal life. In the army, he had learned what it meant to earn respect rather than simply inherit it. As the plane descended toward Heathrow, Harry felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied returns to England. The country of his birth had become a complicated place for him, full of memories both cherished and painful, relationships both damaged and irreplaceable. The media presence would be intense, every expression analyzed, every gesture interpreted through the lens of ongoing family drama. He was met at the airport by a small security detail and whisked away to a private location where he would spend the remaining days before the funeral. The palace had arranged minimal interaction with other family members beforehand, a decision that Harry understood even as it saddened him. Too much remained unresolved between him and William, between him and Charles, for casual reunions to be possible. The isolation gave him time to think, perhaps too much time. He found himself remembering moments with Philip that had nothing to do with royal duties or public appearances. The Duke teaching him to drive on the private roads of Balmoral, his patience infinite as Harry stalled the Land Rover again and again. Philip's dry humor during boring state functions, whispered observations that made Harry struggle not to laugh at inappropriate moments. The way his grandfather had quietly supported his military ambitions even when others in the family had worried about the risks. There had been a conversation during Harry's second deployment when Philip had called him directly, a rare occurrence that had surprised everyone at the base. The Duke had simply wanted to know how he was doing, whether he needed anything, whether the work was what he had hoped it would be. For 15 minutes, they had talked soldier to soldier, grandfather to grandson, about the weight of responsibility and the privilege of service. The uniform is just cloth, Philip had said near the end of that call. What matters is the commitment you make when you put it on. That commitment doesn't end when you take it off. Now, preparing to attend Philip's funeral in civilian clothes, Harry wondered what his grandfather would think of the palace's decision. Would he see it as appropriate adherence to protocol, or would he understand the deeper wound it represented? Philip had always been a stickler for proper procedures, but he had also been a military man who understood the bonds forged in service. The media coverage in the days leading up to the funeral was relentless, with every aspect of the arrangements dissected and analyzed. The decision about Harry's attire became a major story, with veterans groups and military commentators weighing in on both sides. Some argued that stepping away from royal duties meant accepting the consequences, including the loss of certain privileges. Others maintained that military service transcended royal protocol, that Harry's contributions in Afghanistan and his ongoing work with veterans earned him the right to wear his uniform regardless of his current status. Harry tried to avoid the coverage, but it was impossible to escape entirely. The debate seemed to miss the deeper point about what the military had meant to him, how it had shaped not just his public identity but his understanding of himself. This wasn't about privilege or protocol, it was about belonging, about being allowed to honor his service and his grandfather's memory in a way that felt authentic to who he had become. As the day of the funeral approached, Harry found himself thinking about all the military funerals he had attended, all the young soldiers he had helped carry to their final rest. He remembered the weight of their bodies, the grief of their families, the terrible pride mixed with sorrow that defined those ceremonies. The uniform had never been about him in those moments, it had been about honoring something larger than any individual. He thought about the veterans he worked with through the Invictus Games, men and women who had given everything in service to their countries and were now fighting different battles with injury, trauma, and recovery. Many of them had told him how much his continued involvement meant to them, how seeing a member of the royal family who truly understood their experiences helped them feel less forgotten by the institutions they had served. The night before the funeral, Harry stood at his window looking out at the lights of London. Tomorrow he would walk behind his grandfather's coffin, would sit in St. George's Chapel surrounded by family members with whom his relationships had become strained or broken. He would do so in mourning dress, as a civilian, as someone whose military service had apparently been deemed less worthy of recognition than that of others who would wear their uniforms with pride. But, Philip's words echoed in his mind, the uniform is just cloth. What matters is the commitment you make when you put it on. That commitment doesn't end when you take it off. Harry understood now that his grandfather had been preparing him for this moment, for the possibility that external recognition of his service might be withdrawn but that the core of what he had learned and become would remain unchanged. The commitment he had made to his fellow soldiers, to the military community, to the values he had learned in service, none of that could be taken away by protocol or politics. As he prepared for sleep, his last night before saying goodbye to the man who had encouraged him to find his purpose through service, Harry felt something shift inside him. The anger and hurt remained, but alongside them grew a quiet determination. Tomorrow he would honor his grandfather not through the uniform he wore but through the dignity with which he carried himself, the respect he showed for the occasion, and the commitment he maintained to the values Philip had helped him discover. The uniform might be just cloth, but the man who had earned the right to wear it would endure long after the ceremony ended, long after the protocols and politics faded into history. Philip would understand that, Harry thought. Philip would understand that some forms of service transcend the symbols meant to represent them. In the darkness of his room, surrounded by the weight of family history and personal loss, Harry began to prepare himself for one of the most difficult days of his life, knowing that how he faced it would define not just how others saw him, but how he saw himself in the years to come. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and cold, with a sharp wind that cut through the April air like a blade. Harry had been awake since before dawn, unable to sleep through the final hours before he would face the most challenging day since leaving his royal duties behind. He stood before the mirror in his temporary quarters, adjusting the black morning coat that felt foreign against his skin after years of military ceremonies where he had worn his dress uniform with pride. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Where once he would have donned the blue dress uniform of the Blues and Royals, complete with the Afghanistan Service Medal and other honors that told the story of his military journey, today he wore the civilian attire that marked him as something else entirely. Not quite royal anymore, not quite civilian, occupying an uncomfortable space between worlds that the palace protocols seemed determined to emphasize. His phone buzzed with a message from Megan, sent from California where she was dealing with their young son's questions about why Daddy had to go away when great-grandpa Philip died. Archie had met his great-grandfather only a handful of times, but he had absorbed enough from adult conversations to understand that something important and sad was happening. Harry's heart ached thinking about his son growing up with such limited connection to this side of his heritage, but he also felt relief that Archie would be spared the complicated emotions that came with being born into an institution that could love and wound you simultaneously. The car journey to Windsor felt endless despite taking less than an hour. Harry watched the English countryside roll past, remembering countless similar journeys during his childhood when these trips had felt like adventures rather than ordeals. He had loved Windsor as a boy, loved the sense of history and tradition that permeated every stone of the ancient castle. Philip had been his guide through many of those childhood explorations, pointing out architectural details, sharing stories of past monarchs, making history feel alive and accessible. Now those same stones felt like witnesses to his diminished status, silent observers of how far he had fallen from grace in the eyes of the institution that had shaped his identity for over 3 decades. The irony was bitter. He had left royal duties to protect his mental health and his family's well-being, but returning for this farewell to his grandfather felt like the most psychologically damaging experience he had endured since Diana's funeral. The security arrangements at Windsor were elaborate but discreet, with police and military personnel maintaining the perimeter while family members and guests arrived throughout the morning. Harry caught glimpses of relatives he had not seen since his wedding, faces that had once been familiar now seeming distant and formal. The COVID restrictions meant that interactions would be minimal anyway, but he sensed that even without the pandemic protocols, the warmth that had once characterized family gatherings had been permanently altered by recent events. William arrived separately, and the brothers exchanged brief nods of acknowledgement without the easy familiarity that had once defined their relationship. The gulf between them felt oceanic now, widened by different life choices, different perspectives on their royal inheritance, and different responses to the pressures that had shaped their adult lives. Harry felt the loss of that relationship almost as keenly as his grief for Philip, understanding that some damage might be too extensive for simple reconciliation. The sight of Andrew in his naval uniform was a knife twist Harry had tried to prepare himself for but which still struck with unexpected force. His uncle wore the dark blue uniform with apparent comfort, the medals and decorations telling the story of his Falklands service and subsequent naval career. There was no acknowledgement between them, no recognition of the contrast their respective attire represented, but Harry felt the weight of that symbolism settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Other military attendees moved through the chapel preparations with the crisp efficiency that Harry remembered from his own service days. Senior officers, ceremonial guards, and security personnel all carried themselves with the bearing that had once been second nature to him. Watching them, he felt like an outsider observing a world he had once belonged to but could no longer fully claim as his own. The chapel itself was magnificent in its solemnity, decorated with flowers chosen to reflect Philip's love of the natural world and his naval heritage. The Duke's naval cap and sword lay on the altar, symbols of a lifetime of service that had defined not just his public role but his personal identity. Harry wondered if his grandfather had ever felt the kind of disconnection from military life that now plagued him, whether stepping back from active service into royal duties had required similar adjustments and compromises. As guests began to take their seats, Harry found himself positioned several rows back from the principal mourners, another subtle reminder of his changed status within the family hierarchy. The seating arrangement had been carefully planned to reflect current royal precedents, and his position spoke volumes about how the palace viewed his decision to step away from official duties. He would watch his grandfather's funeral from a distance that felt both literal and metaphorical. The Queen entered last, a small figure in black who somehow managed to embody both fragility and strength. At 95, having lost her husband of 73 years, she moved with careful dignity that spoke to decades of public service and personal sacrifice. Harry felt a surge of protective love for his grandmother, mixed with guilt about the additional stress his decisions had placed on her during her final years. Philip's death had left her truly alone in a way that made Harry's physical distance from the family feel even more significant. As the service began, Harry tried to focus on the celebration of Philip's life rather than the politics surrounding his own attendance. The reading spoke of service, duty, and faith, themes that had defined the Duke's 99 years and which resonated with values Harry still held dear despite his changed circumstances. Philip had served in the Royal Navy during World War II, had dedicated his life to supporting the Queen and the Commonwealth, had championed countless causes and organizations with energy that seemed boundless even into his final years. The Dean of Windsor spoke about Philip's character with warmth and specificity that brought the man behind the public figure into sharp focus. He had been demanding but fair, traditional but adaptable, someone who understood that true service required both personal sacrifice and the courage to evolve with changing times. Harry wondered if his grandfather would have understood his own difficult choices, whether the Duke who had given up his naval career to support the Queen might have recognized similar tensions between personal fulfillment and institutional duty in his grandson's decision. During the hymns, Harry's voice caught on familiar words that carried new weight in this context. Eternal Father, strong to save had been sung at military funerals he had attended in Afghanistan and, afterward, a prayer for those who served at sea and in dangerous places far from home. The melody brought back memories of young soldiers' funerals, of standing in uniform among fellow service members, of being part of something larger than himself that had given his life meaning and direction. The silence that followed each hymn felt profound, filled with private grief and public ceremony in equal measure. Harry used those quiet moments to say his own goodbye to Philip, remembering conversations and encounters that had shaped his understanding of duty, service, and responsibility. His grandfather had not been an emotionally expressive man, but his influence had been profound, especially during the turbulent years following Diana's death when Harry had struggled to find his place in the world. When the military honors began, Harry felt his exclusion most acutely. The Naval Guard, the ceremonial protocols, the recognition of Philip's military service all proceeded without any acknowledgement of Harry's own contributions to military life. He watched as other family members in uniform participated in aspects of the ceremony that had been closed to him, feeling like a spectator at an event where he should have been a participant. The moment when Philip's coffin was lowered into the royal vault was marked by naval traditions that spoke to a lifetime of service at sea. The ceremonial whistle calls, the removal of decorations, the final salute all carried deep meaning for those who understood military protocol. Harry understood, but his understanding came from the position of an observer rather than a participant, a distinction that highlighted everything he had lost by choosing a different path. As the service concluded and family members began to file out, Harry caught sight of Charles, his father looking older than his years and bearing the weight of recent family tensions along with his grief for Philip. Their eyes met briefly, and Harry saw exhaustion rather than anger in his father's gaze, a weariness that spoke to the emotional toll the past year had taken on everyone involved. There was no communication beyond that moment of eye contact, but Harry sensed that his father understood the difficulty of his position even if he could not publicly acknowledge it. The reception afterward was limited by COVID protocols but provided opportunities for brief conversations among family members who had been separated by distance and disagreement. Harry found himself navigating carefully, trying to honor his grandfather's memory while avoiding discussions that might reignite old conflicts. Several relatives expressed genuine sympathy for the difficulty of his position, acknowledging privately what could not be said publicly about the fairness of the uniform decision. Catherine approached him during a quiet moment, her presence offering a bridge between the brothers that neither seemed able to cross directly. She spoke briefly about the children, about how they had remembered their great-grandfather, about the importance of family connections that transcended current difficulties. Her words were carefully chosen but genuinely warm, suggesting that some relationships might survive the institutional pressures that had damaged others. As the day wore on, Harry began to understand that his grandfather's funeral would mark not just the end of Philip's remarkable life but also a turning point in his own relationship with his royal heritage. The ceremony had demonstrated conclusively that his decision to step back from royal duties carried consequences that extended beyond formal roles into deeply personal territory. The institution would remember his military service when convenient but would not hesitate to strip away the symbols of that service when his loyalty came into question. Yet watching his grandmother's dignified grief, witnessing the genuine affection with which people spoke of Philip's legacy, Harry also understood something else. Service and dedication transcended uniforms and protocols. His grandfather's true memorial would not be found in the military honors or ceremonial traditions, important though they were, but in the lives he had touched, the causes he had championed, and the example he had set of putting duty above personal preference. As afternoon faded toward evening and the formal obligations of the day concluded, Harry prepared for his return journey to California with mixed emotions. The pain of exclusion remained sharp, the sense of lost identity still profound, but alongside those feelings grew something that might have been resolution. He had said goodbye to his grandfather with dignity, had honored the man's memory without compromising his own principles, had demonstrated that stepping away from royal duties did not mean abandoning the values those duties were meant to serve. The flight home would give him time to process what had been perhaps the most emotionally complex day of his adult life. He would return to Meghan and Archie with stories of the ceremony, with memories of his grandfather that could be shared without the institutional baggage that had complicated every aspect of his attendance. He would continue his work with veterans and military families, understanding now more clearly than ever that his service to those communities did not depend on recognition from the palace or permission from protocol offices. Philip would have understood, Harry thought as his car pulled away from Windsor Castle for what might be the last time. The old Duke had spent a lifetime balancing personal desires against institutional demands, had given up his own naval career to serve a larger purpose, had found ways to maintain his identity within the constraints of royal duty. He would have recognized the courage required to choose a different path, even when that choice carried a price measured in symbols that had once meant everything. The airplane cabin felt like a sanctuary as Harry settled into his seat for the long journey back to California, finally, alone with his thoughts after the most emotionally exhausting day he had experienced since leaving England. The funeral was behind him, but the weight of what had transpired would take much longer to process fully. He stared out the window as London faded below, thinking about how different this departure felt from his first journey to America as a married man, full of hope and possibility. The contrast between his expectations then and his reality now was stark. When he and Meghan had first spoken about stepping back from royal duties, they had envisioned a gradual transition that would allow them to maintain their military and charitable connections while building a more independent life. The idea that his military service would be questioned, that his right to wear the uniform he had earned would be revoked, had never seriously occurred to him. The awakening had been brutal and complete. During the first hour of the flight, Harry found himself replaying every moment of the funeral, searching for signs of what relationships might be salvageable and which bridges had been permanently burned. William's coldness had been expected but still painful, a reminder of how completely their brotherhood had fractured under the pressure of their different choices and perspectives. The brother who had once been his closest friend, his partner in grief and mischief, now felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Charles had seemed genuinely overwhelmed by the loss of Philip, and Harry wondered if his father was beginning to understand the true cost of the rigid protocols that govern royal life. Watching his own son excluded from military honors at his grandfather's funeral might have given the future king pause about the wisdom of punitive measures that served institutional pride more than family harmony. But, if Charles felt any regret about the uniform decision, he had not been able to express it publicly or privately. The Queen's dignified sorrow had been the most difficult aspect of the day to witness. At 95, having lost her husband and watching her family splinter under pressures both internal and external, she embodied a kind of stoic endurance that commanded respect even from those who questioned the system she represented. Harry's love for his grandmother remained unchanged, but their relationship would never recover the easy affection that had characterized his childhood visits to her various residences. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, Harry began composing mental letters to the veterans who had reached out to him following news of the uniform decision. Messages of support had poured in from military communities around the world, from Afghanistan veterans who had served alongside him, from wounded warriors who had participated in Invictus Games competitions, from serving members who understood that his commitment to military values transcended whatever uniform he was or wasn't permitted to wear. Their support had been overwhelming and humbling, reminding him that his identity as a veteran was not something that could be revoked by royal protocol. The men and women who had seen him in combat, who had witnessed his dedication to military causes in the years since leaving active service, who had benefited from programs he had created or supported, they understood what the palace seemed determined to ignore. Military service created bonds that existed independent of institutional approval. One message in particular had stayed with him, from a former Apache pilot who had trained with him years earlier. "The uniform represents us," the message had read, "but we represent something bigger than any uniform. You know who you are, and so do we." Those words had provided more comfort than any official recognition could have offered, because they came from someone who truly understood what service meant. The more he thought about it, the more Harry began to see the uniform controversy as a clarifying moment rather than simply a painful one. The palace's decision had forced him to confront fundamental questions about identity, belonging, and the source of his self-worth that he might have continued avoiding otherwise. For too many years, he had tied his sense of purpose to external validation, to titles and ceremonies and institutional recognition that could apparently be withdrawn at will. His work with the Invictus Games had shown him a different model of service, one based on action rather than symbol, on results rather than recognition. The veterans who participated in those competitions didn't compete for royal approval or institutional validation. They competed to prove to themselves and each other that injury and trauma need not define the limits of human potential. Their courage was self-validating, their service self-evident. Harry remembered a conversation with a British soldier who had lost both legs to an improvised explosive device in Helmand province but who had gone on to compete in Paralympic cycling events. When asked what motivated his training, the soldier had said simply, "I'm still the same person I was before the bomb. I just had to find a different way to show it." That wisdom seemed relevant now in ways Harry was only beginning to understand. The decision to exclude him from wearing his military uniform had been intended as punishment, a way of demonstrating the consequences of choosing family loyalty over institutional compliance. But perhaps it was actually a gift, forcing him to separate his identity as a veteran from his identity as a member of the royal family. His service in Afghanistan, his work with wounded warriors, his dedication to military causes, none of that required royal approval to be meaningful or worthwhile. As the flight continued through the night, Harry began thinking about how to explain the day to Archie, how to help his son understand the complicated legacy he had inherited. The little boy would grow up knowing about his royal connections but, not being defined by them, would understand military service as something admirable without needing ceremonial validation to make it real. Perhaps that freedom from institutional expectations would allow Archie to serve others in ways that were more authentic and, ultimately, more meaningful. Megan would understand better than anyone the relief mixed with sadness that characterized his current emotions. She had experienced her own version of institutional rejection, had felt the weight of protocols and expectations that seemed designed to diminish rather than celebrate individual contributions. Together, they had learned that stepping away from systems that damaged their well-being required courage but also offered opportunities for authentic self-expression that had been impossible within royal constraints. The military community would continue to welcome his involvement regardless of what uniform he was or wasn't permitted to wear. Veterans organizations around the world had made clear that they valued his ongoing commitment to their causes, his willingness to use his platform to highlight their needs and achievements. The Invictus Games had grown into a global movement that touched thousands of lives, and that growth had nothing to do with royal titles or ceremonial dress. Harry found himself thinking about specific veterans he had worked with over the years, men and women whose courage in facing devastating injuries and trauma had redefined his understanding of strength and resilience. Many of them had been forced to reconstruct their identities after service, to find new ways of defining themselves when old certainties were stripped away. Their example might guide him through his own process of redefinition. The soldier who had become a Paralympic cyclist despite losing both legs. The pilot who had retrained as a counselor after traumatic brain injury ended her flying career. The medic who had started a non-profit supporting military families despite dealing with severe PTSD. All of them had faced the choice between accepting limitation or finding new paths to meaning and contribution. All of them had chosen growth over resentment, service over self-pity. Their examples suggested that identity crises, even painful ones, could become opportunities for growth and authentic self-discovery. The uniform controversy had forced Harry to confront the difference between who he was and who he was expected to be, between the service he wanted to provide and the service the institution would permit. That confrontation was painful but potentially liberating. As dawn began to break over the American continent, Harry felt something shift in his perspective on the previous day's events. Yes, he had been excluded from wearing the uniform he had earned through service and sacrifice. Yes, that exclusion had been designed to demonstrate his diminished status within the royal hierarchy. But the ceremony had also shown him something else: his commitment to military values and veteran causes did not depend on institutional approval. The palace could control his uniform but not his integrity. They could limit his ceremonial role but not his capacity for service. They could demonstrate his changed status within the royal family, but they could not alter the relationships he had built with military communities around the world or the impact he had already achieved through his veteran advocacy work. By the time the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Harry had begun to see the funeral as both an ending and a beginning. He had said goodbye to his grandfather with dignity and love, had endured institutional rejection with grace, had demonstrated that his values transcended the symbols meant to represent them. The man who disembarked in California was different from the one who had departed England days earlier, marked by loss but also clarified by experience. Meghan was waiting for him at the airport, her presence a reminder of the life he had chosen and the family he had prioritized over institutional expectations. Archie ran to him with the uncomplicated joy of a child who understood that Daddy was home, that the sad business with great-grandpa Philip was finished, that their family was complete again. In that moment, Harry understood that the most important uniform he wore was that of husband and father, roles that no protocol office could regulate or revoke. The drive home through the California sunshine felt like traveling from one world to another, from the weight of centuries-old traditions to the lightness of self-determined existence. Harry talked with Meghan about the ceremony, about the family dynamics he had observed, about the recognition that this had probably been his last formal royal occasion. There was sadness in that realization but also relief, the kind of clarity that comes from understanding exactly where you stand. That evening, as he helped put Archie to bed, Harry told his son simple stories about great-grandpa Philip, about his naval service and his love of sailing, about how he had spent his long life trying to help people and protect the environment. The stories focused on character and values rather than titles and ceremonies, on the kind of service that mattered regardless of what uniform accompanied it. Later, sitting in their garden under the California stars, Harry and Meghan talked about the future they were building together, about the work they wanted to do, about the example they hoped to set for their children. The conversation ranged from specific projects they were developing to broader questions about how to maintain connection to worthy causes while protecting their family's well-being. Harry realized that the funeral had answered questions he had been avoiding about his relationship with his royal heritage. The institution had made clear that his service would be acknowledged when convenient and rejected when inconvenient, that his dedication to military causes mattered less than his compliance with protocol expectations. Understanding that reality, painful though it was, freed him to focus on work that would be valued for its intrinsic merit rather than its royal association. The uniform controversy had been intended as punishment, but it had become something else entirely, a liberation from expectations and constraints that had limited his potential for authentic service. The man who had served in Afghanistan, who had created the Invictus Games, who had dedicated years to supporting wounded warriors and military families, that man existed independent of royal titles or ceremonial dress. Philip would have understood, Harry thought as he watched the stars wheel overhead in the clear California sky. The old Duke had spent a lifetime balancing personal desires against institutional demands, had found ways to serve meaningfully within constraints that sometimes felt suffocating. But Philip had also understood that the deepest forms of service transcended ceremony and protocol, that character mattered more than costume. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new ways to serve the military community that had given him purpose and identity during his most difficult years. The uniform he had been denied permission to wear at his grandfather's funeral was only cloth, as Philip had once reminded him. The commitment it represented, the values it embodied, the relationships it had forged, those things endured regardless of ceremonial recognition. Harry fell asleep that night with a clarity he had not felt in months, understanding finally that his worth as a veteran, as an advocate for military causes, as a man dedicated to service, did not depend on permission from protocol offices or approval from royal institutions. The uniform had never made the soldier. The soldier had always made the uniform meaningful. 6 months after Philip's funeral, Harry stood before a gathering of wounded veterans in Denver, looking out at faces that told stories of courage, sacrifice, and resilience that humbled him every time he encountered them. The Invictus Games had brought together competitors from 20 nations, men and women who had transformed devastating injuries into platforms for inspiring others. As he prepared to address them, Harry reflected on how much his understanding of service and identity had evolved since that difficult day at Windsor Castle. The uniform controversy that had seemed so devastating at the time now felt like a necessary catalyst for personal growth he might never have achieved otherwise. Standing before these veterans, Harry understood that his authority to speak about military service came not from what he was permitted to wear but from what he had experienced, what he had learned, and what he continued to contribute to their community. The intervening months had been filled with work that felt more meaningful than any ceremonial duty he had ever performed. The Invictus Games had expanded into new countries, reaching veterans who had never imagined themselves capable of competitive athletics after their injuries. Mental health programs he had helped develop were providing support to thousands of military families dealing with trauma and transition. Documentary projects he had initiated were bringing public attention to veteran issues that had long been overlooked. None of this work required royal approval or ceremonial validation. It succeeded or failed based on its impact on the lives it was meant to serve. The metrics that mattered were not media coverage or institutional recognition but measurable improvements in veteran welfare, increased funding for support programs, and growing public understanding of military sacrifice and resilience. The veteran community had embraced his continued involvement with an enthusiasm that sometimes overwhelmed him. Letters arrived daily from serving members and veterans around the world, expressing gratitude for his advocacy work and sharing stories of how programs he had supported had changed their lives. Their acceptance was complete and unconditional, based entirely on his demonstrated commitment to their welfare rather than any title or ceremonial status. Harry had begun to understand that his exclusion from wearing military uniform at Philip's funeral had inadvertently freed him from constraints he had not fully recognized. As a working royal, his military advocacy had been carefully managed by palace communications teams concerned with broader institutional image and political sensitivities. Now, operating independently, he could respond more directly to veteran needs and speak more honestly about military issues. The freedom to express authentic opinions about veteran care, military mental health, and the challenges facing returning service members had energized his work in ways that surprised him. Without needing to clear statements through protocol offices or worry about how his words might affect broader royal relationships, Harry found his voice as an advocate becoming stronger and more effective. During a recent visit to a veteran rehabilitation center in Los Angeles, he had spent hours with a former Marine who had lost 3 limbs to an improvised explosive device in Iraq. The young man's journey from devastating injury to Paralympic competition had been marked by setbacks, breakthroughs, and a resilience that defied easy comprehension. Toward the end of their conversation, the Marine had said something that stayed with Harry for weeks afterward. "The hardest part wasn't losing my legs," he had explained. "It was learning that I was still the same person inside, that my value wasn't tied to what my body could do or what uniform I could wear. Once I understood that, everything else became possible." Those words had struck Harry with unexpected force, highlighting parallels between physical injury and the psychological wounds inflicted by institutional rejection. Both required a fundamental reassessment of identity, a separation of self-worth from external validation, a commitment to growth that transcended immediate circumstances. The process of rebuilding his sense of purpose after the funeral had been neither quick nor easy. There had been days when the weight of severed family relationships and lost institutional connections felt overwhelming. The media coverage of his life remained largely negative, focusing on conflicts and controversies rather than his ongoing work with military causes. Public opinion remained divided about his choices, with many viewing his departure from royal duties as selfish or irresponsible. But the veteran community had provided a constant source of perspective and encouragement. Their own experiences with trauma, loss, and recovery offered models for navigating identity crises with grace and determination. Watching wounded warriors transform their injuries into sources of strength and inspiration showed Harry that devastation could become the foundation for more authentic and meaningful existence. Meghan had been instrumental in helping him process the complex emotions surrounding his grandfather's funeral and its aftermath. Her own experience with institutional rejection had given her unique insight into the psychological challenges he faced. Together, they had worked to separate justified anger about unfair treatment from destructive resentment that could poison their future happiness. The conversations with Meghan often returned to questions about the example they wanted to set for their children, about how to teach Archie and his younger sister to value service and integrity without becoming dependent on external validation or institutional approval. Those discussions had helped clarify Harry's understanding of what kind of legacy he wanted to leave, what values he wanted to embody regardless of how others chose to recognize or ignore his contributions. As the Invictus Games had grown in scope and impact, Harry had found himself working with an increasingly diverse group of veterans, military leaders, and advocacy organizations from around the world. Their collaboration had taught him that meaningful service transcended national boundaries, institutional loyalties, and ceremonial traditions. The common thread among all effective military advocates was not their formal status but their genuine commitment to improving veteran welfare. One particularly powerful experience had occurred during a visit to a Canadian veteran rehabilitation facility where he met a former peacekeeper who had lost her sight during a mission in the Balkans. She had gone on to become a leading advocate for veteran mental health services, using her own experience with trauma and recovery to help others navigate similar challenges. When Harry complimented her on the impact of her work, she had responded with characteristic directness. "The uniform gave us a way to serve our countries," she had said. "But that service doesn't end when we take the uniform off. It just takes different forms. Sometimes the most important service happens after we've left the military, when we use what we've learned to help others who are facing the same challenges we faced." Her perspective had illuminated something Harry had been struggling to articulate about his own journey. Military service had taught him values and given him experiences that could benefit others long after his active duty ended. The uniform had been a symbol of those values, but it was not the source of them. His capacity to serve the veteran community did not depend on ceremonial recognition or institutional approval. The documentary projects he had been developing offered another avenue for meaningful contribution to military causes. Working with veteran filmmakers and journalists, Harry had been documenting stories of recovery and resilience that highlighted both the challenges facing military families and the extraordinary capacity for growth and adaptation that characterized many veteran experiences. These projects reached audiences that traditional advocacy could not touch, changing public perception through personal narrative rather than policy argument. One documentary had focused on the wives and mothers of deployed soldiers, exploring how military families coped with separation, uncertainty, and the constant awareness that their loved ones faced danger. Another had followed wounded veterans through their rehabilitation journeys, showing the daily reality of recovery from traumatic injuries. A third had examined the transition challenges facing veterans returning to civilian employment, highlighting successful programs and persistent barriers. Each project had required extensive collaboration with military families and veteran organizations, relationships built on trust and mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. The families who shared their stories did so because they believed in the potential for positive change, not because they were impressed by royal titles or ceremonial status. Their willingness to be vulnerable in service of helping others facing similar challenges humbled Harry and reinforced his understanding of what authentic service looked like. The success of these projects had attracted attention from major media organizations and streaming platforms, creating opportunities for even broader impact. But Harry had learned to evaluate such opportunities based on their potential benefit to military communities rather than their potential enhancement of his own profile. The goal was always to amplify veteran voices and highlight their needs, not to rehabilitate his own public image. As he stood before the Invictus Games competitors in Denver, Harry reflected on how completely his understanding of success and recognition had evolved since Philip's funeral. The veterans gathered before him represented the true measure of meaningful achievement: lives changed, barriers overcome, communities strengthened. Their applause was not polite acknowledgement of his royal status but genuine appreciation for his continued commitment to their welfare. The speech he delivered that evening focused on themes that had become central to his evolving understanding of service and identity. He spoke about the difference between recognition and validation, about finding purpose through contribution rather than ceremonial status, about the courage required to rebuild identity after devastating loss. The audience listened with the attention of people who understood these concepts not as abstract philosophy but as lived experience. Following the ceremony, Harry spent hours in informal conversation with competitors and their families, hearing stories of triumph that put his own challenges in perspective. A British paratrooper who had lost both arms to an improvised explosive device had taught himself to paint with brushes held in his mouth. An American Marine who had suffered traumatic brain injury had become a marathon runner and motivational speaker. A Canadian soldier who had been diagnosed with severe PTSD had founded a non-profit organization supporting military families dealing with mental health challenges. Each story reinforced the central lesson Harry had been learning throughout the months since Philip's funeral, that human worth and capacity for contribution were not diminished by institutional rejection or ceremonial exclusion. The veterans he met that evening had all faced moments when their previous identities had been stripped away, when they had been forced to discover new sources of meaning and purpose. Their examples showed that such crises, however painful, could become opportunities for more authentic and impactful existence. The flight home to California gave Harry time to process the emotional richness of the Denver experience and to think about the future projects and commitments that would define the next phase of his military advocacy work. The Invictus Games were expanding into new countries and new sports, reaching veterans who had never imagined themselves capable of competitive athletics. Mental health initiatives were providing support to military families dealing with trauma and transition. Educational programs were bringing veteran experiences into schools and universities, helping new generations understand the reality of military service and sacrifice. All of this work felt more meaningful than any ceremonial duty he had ever performed, more aligned with his authentic interests and capabilities. The recognition it brought was based on measurable impact rather than inherited status, on demonstrated commitment rather than protocol compliance. Veterans valued his involvement because it produced tangible benefits for their communities, not because it fulfilled traditional expectations about royal service. As the plane crossed the American continent toward home, Harry understood that the journey from devastation to fulfillment that had begun with his exclusion from wearing military uniform at Philip's funeral was far from complete. There would be more challenges, more opportunities, more chances to prove that service transcended ceremony and that authentic contribution mattered more than institutional recognition. But the foundation was solid now, built on relationships with military communities that valued action over appearance, on projects that measured success through lives changed rather than media coverage, on an understanding of identity that was rooted in character rather than costume. Philip would have been proud, Harry thought, of the man his grandson was becoming and the service he was learning to provide without need for ceremonial validation or royal approval. The uniform had been just cloth after all, as the old Duke had once observed. The man who had earned the right to wear it, the values he had learned through service, the commitment he maintained to his fellow veterans, those things endured regardless of what protocol offices decided or palace communications teams approved. They endured because they were real, because they mattered, because they changed lives in ways that ceremony alone never could.